So you want to make UI for video games, huh? Well, you've come to the right place, unlike me apparently. What is the UI? The UI, or user interface, is basically everything that the person that plays the game needs to interact with your game. So let's say you have an item in your game, then that item is part of the game space and not the UI. But if the item has an icon or some overlay that enables the player to learn about the item or interact with the item, then that's the user interface. So basically the UI is everything that the gamer needs to play the game. So how do we define good UI design? Well, of course, there's norms and guidelines that tell us what's bad and good UI design, but for this tutorial, we'll be using the CISS model: consistency, intuitivity, simplicity, and suitability. I'll go over all of these terms individually throughout the tutorial, and I'm going to be explaining how to make good UI design with the use of UI design that I've made during my internship at GameLab Ost. A great first step when making a good UI is creating a bunch of mood boards. A mood board is a collection of inspiration, like images or colors, all put into one collage. This helps you later on staying on the right track or getting inspired and much more. After you've created a good amount of mood boards and know the rough artistic direction you'll be heading to, you should start making wireframes. Wireframes are super important when it comes to UI design, as the low amount of quality they are required to be made allows you to create many designs and layouts within just a very short time frame. I recommend using the program Adobe XD, as it is made for creating wireframes and even allows you to turn them into clickable prototypes, which can then easily be shared. But of course there's free alternatives like Marvel or simple drawing programs, or even handmade wireframes will perfectly do the job. For this tutorial I will be focusing on only one part of the game that I've been working on with my group at GameLab Ost. This part is somewhat of a mini game where the player is performing chest compressions on a patient. As I've just mentioned, the first step is creating a wireframe for this scene. Here you can see the wireframe I've created. I used a gray box for each interaction or UI element I wanted in the screen and moved them around to achieve the layout I thought was right. Feel free to create several versions of the same screen with slight iterations to really see which layout will be the strongest. But now that we have a wireframe that we're happy with, let's turn this into a first design and prototype. Since we've already created a wireframe in the previous step, it is quite simple to now go from a wireframe to a first design, which could totally be hand-drawn since it is still subject to change and should first be tested. I also recommend always prototyping your design before testing. For this reason, I decided to animate this first UI design and made a GIF, which is a totally viable form of a prototype. Other forms could be paper prototypes, clickable prototypes, done with Adobe XD for example, or already coded into your game engine like Unity. Before moving on to testing this prototype though, let's take a look at the first term from the CISS model, consistency. If something always behaves the same way, it is defined as being consistent. When it comes to designing user interfaces for video games, it is very important to stay consistent and stick to set rules to not bring unnecessary confusion or frustration to the player. When applying this to our current design, we will see an interesting consistency flaw in this design. As you might have noticed, the layout of the keys guided the layout of the UI a little bit. The spacebar and its according UI is located on the bottom middle of the screen, just as it is placed on a keyboard in real life. Similarly, the power meter is controlled by the W and S key and is therefore located on the left side of the screen to resemble the keyboard once again. Using the WASD keys for movement or similar in video games is nothing new to any PC gamer. But when we're looking at the target group for this game, we notice that the target group are healthcare professionals and not necessarily gamers. For this reason, a change in key bindings and layout is needed. Because arrow up and down keys are much more intuitive for the target group, moving them to the right side of the screen and changing them can create a much more consistent design. Testing your designs over and over is crucial. Gathering feedback and then repeating the steps of designing, prototyping and testing over and over until you reach your desired goal can be a tedious but necessary process. When this UI was tested, for example, it got quite clear that the UI was too crowded and not intuitive enough. The playtesters had no idea where to look and what to do. So what is intuitiveness and how do we use it? Something that is intuitive, is easy to understand or to operate without any explicit instructions. An intuitive design doesn't obstruct the gameplay, but rather aids the player. To achieve intuitiveness in user interfaces, it is important to be predictable for the player and provide only the information that is needed. Sounds good, right? Let's take out all the unnecessary stuff from our UI and put it all into one place. See how the UI immediately becomes less crowded and overwhelming? The idea of the new UI is simple. The small heartbeat coming from the right of the screen, which helps the player knowing the beat in which they must press the spacebar, is tied together with the power at which the player has to press. The longer the spacebar is pressed, the more power they give, which again is shown by the size of the heartbeat. This adds intuitiveness, because it enables the player to learn the features themselves by getting immediate feedback from their button presses, and through that, figure out how the mechanic works. Now that our design is intuitive, let's test it again. As previously mentioned, testing is extremely important. Through testing, you manage to find flaws in your design and can really test if people understand your user interface. As it turns out, when a person is suffering from cardiac arrest, they don't have any heartbeat. And even though this was a known fact to me while creating the UI, I still believed there would be a nice way of showing the beat in which the player has to press the button by using a heartbeat. If this product was directed at casual gamers that have no connection to healthcare, that might be fine. But since the target audience are healthcare professionals, things like this could really throw them off and make the product look illegitimate. In addition to that, the UI was optimized for the PC, but not really the mobile version, and therefore led to even more problems when realizing that mobile might be the way to go. So let's try to fix these. It is important to know the platform you're developing your user interface for. In this case, for example, the original platform we developed for was a PC version, with a possibility to maybe later translating into mobile. But throughout the process, we realized that the focus should lay on mobile, with maybe a possibility of porting it to PC later. And the most important lesson to draw from this is that you should always focus on the smallest version when it comes to designing UI. It is much easier to just add some features later on than removing some. And when you're working on a small platform like mobile devices, it is even more crucial to keep your designs simple. Less is more is a very commonly known rule when it comes to design and shouldn't be looked at lightly. A good UI must be simple in both its look and feel to save the player from confusion or even eye fatigue. This can be achieved by grouping or even removing duplicate or less important features to help the players find their way. While the previous design was already somewhat simple, the new design should be even simpler to really work and be seen at a small mobile screen without any problems. Since the most important feature was the depth meter, it was made big and the depth was indicated by a ruler, clearly showing which amount of pressure is correct. The visual indicator which helps the player to keep the correct rhythm is played right next to the ruler, helping to keep all the interactions within one simple UI. But now that we know that this UI with the ruler improves the UI simplicity, how do we know which color the ruler should be? Suitability is very important in UI design, because the UI needs to tell the same story and create similar emotions to what the game is trying to do. Because otherwise the UI will not look like it's part of the game and can easily destroy the player's immersion. If we would choose the black ruler for this part of the UI, then we would not be suiting the game's style. The game is very brightly colored, and having a dark UI would clash and bring a big contrast, which is more distracting than helpful. When choosing between the wooden colored, more realistically colored ruler and the white one, we have a tough decision to make. While the realistic ruler would fit the game style since it is bright yet realistic, it would simply clash too much with the game scene, making it more difficult to spot. The white ruler, on the other hand, creates good contrast while still staying suitable with not only the game, but also the rest of the game's UI, which is taking a lot of inspiration from hospital websites and hospital UIs to stay close to what the target group is used to. Wow, that's a great UI. Of course, there's some flaws in it, so keep going at it and never stop. Until the deadline. Then you should stop. But yeah, hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Of course, I couldn't cover everything there is to know about UI, otherwise this video would have been well over an hour. But now only one question remains. Where did my pants go?
Game over.